In November 1983, the world came closer to nuclear war than almost anyone realized at the time. It wasn't because missiles had already been launched or because leaders had officially declared war. Instead, it was because of a military exercise, something designed only for training. But on the other side of the Iron Curtain, that exercise looked terrifyingly real. Deep inside command bunkers, military analysts studied radar signals, encrypted messages, and troop movements. To them, it appeared that the West might finally be preparing the nuclear strike they had feared for decades. Bombers were put on alert, missile forces began preparing for possible retaliation, and the tension inside Soviet leadership circles grew by the hour. For a brief moment in history, the fate of the entire planet balanced on a dangerous misunderstanding. This was the story of the Cold War operation that nearly triggered World War III. 2. Understand how such a terrifying situation became possible. We have to step back into one of the most dangerous periods in modern history, the Cold War. After the end of World War II, the global balance of power changed dramatically. Two superpowers emerged as the dominant forces on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union, although they had been allies. During the war against Nazi Germany, their political systems and ideologies were completely different. The United States promoted democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union supported communism and one-party rule. What followed was a decades-long geopolitical struggle that reshaped global politics, technology, intelligence, operations, and military strategy. This rivalry didn't involve direct large-scale battles between the two superpowers, but it created a constant atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and competition that spread across the world. One of the most frightening aspects of this rivalry was the nuclear arms race. Both superpowers built massive arsenals of nuclear weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. Over time, their stockpiles grew so large that they could destroy the planet many times over. This led to the development of a terrifying strategic concept known as mutually assured destruction, often shortened to MAD. The idea was simple but horrifying. If either side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would retaliate with equal or greater force, ensuring that both nations and much of the world would be destroyed. In theory, this balance prevented war because neither side wanted to risk total annihilation. But in practice, it meant that the world constantly lived on the edge of disaster. By the early 1980s, Cold War tensions had reached one of their most dangerous peaks. The leadership of the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, had adopted a much tougher stance toward the Soviet Union, describing it as an evil empire and dramatically increasing military spending. New weapons systems were being developed, including plans for advanced missile defense technologies. To American leaders, these actions were meant to pressure the Soviet Union and gain strategic advantage. But from the perspective of Soviet leadership, they looked like preparations for something much more dangerous. At that time, the Soviet Union was led by Yuri Andropov, a former intelligence chief who deeply distrusted Western intentions. Having spent years inside the intelligence world, Andropov believed that the United States might actually be planning a surprise nuclear attack. In his view, Washington's growing military power and aggressive rhetoric suggested that such a possibility could not be ignored. As a result, Soviet intelligence agencies began looking for any possible signs that a Western strike might be coming. This fear led to the creation of one of the most secret intelligence programs of the Cold War. Soviet agents around the world were ordered to watch for even the smallest indicators of nuclear war preparation, things like unusual military movements, sudden increases in communication between Western leaders, or strange patterns in government activity. The program aimed to detect the earliest possible warning signs of an American first strike. Soviet leaders believed that if they could detect such a plan early enough, they might still have time to respond. But this extreme level of paranoia created a dangerous situation. When people are constantly expecting an attack, they can start interpreting normal events as evidence of something much worse. Military exercises, routine troop movements, and training operations could suddenly appear threatening if viewed through the lens of fear and suspicion. And in November 1983, exactly that kind of misunderstanding began to unfold. During that month, the Western military alliance known as NATO launched a command post exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate how NATO forces would escalate a conventional conflict into a nuclear one if war broke out in Europe. It involved complex communication drills, simulated nuclear release procedures, and coordination between multiple military commands. For NATO commanders, this was simply a training exercise meant to test readiness and improve procedures. But inside the Soviet Union, intelligence analysts watching NATO activities began noticing unusual patterns. The exercise involved new encryption systems, higher-level participation from military commanders, and realistic simulations of nuclear command procedures. To Soviet observers who were already on edge, these developments didn't look like a training exercise. They looked like something far more dangerous. Some analysts began to fear that Able Archer might actually be a cover-away to disguise preparations for a real nuclear strike. As the exercise continued, tension inside Soviet leadership circles quietly escalated. Reports began reaching Moscow suggesting that NATO might be preparing for war. Military units were placed on higher alert, and nuclear-capable aircraft were reportedly prepared for possible deployment. The world outside had no idea how serious the situation was becoming. Ordinary people continued their daily routines, completely unaware that a misunderstanding between two nuclear superpowers was slowly building toward a potentially catastrophic moment. What made the situation even more dangerous was that NATO's leaders didn't realize how their actions were being interpreted. From their perspective, everything was proceeding normally. They had no idea that their training exercise was being watched by a rival superpower that feared it might be witnessing the beginning of World War III. And as history has shown many times, the most dangerous conflicts often begin not with deliberate attacks, but with fear, misinterpretation, and a series of decisions made under pressure. For several tense days in November 1983, the possibility of nuclear war hung silently in the background of global politics. It was a moment when one miscalculation, one wrong interpretation, or one panicked decision could have changed the course of human history forever. And although the crisis eventually passed without disaster, the story of Able Archer would later reveal just how fragile the balance of peace truly was during the Cold War. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered one of its most dangerous and unpredictable phases. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had already lasted for decades. But tensions were rising again after a brief period of détente in the 1970s. Instead of cooperation, both superpowers had returned to a strategy of confrontation, military expansion, and ideological competition. One of the most alarming developments came when Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983. This ambitious program aimed to create a space-based missile defense system that could intercept and destroy incoming nuclear missiles before they reached American territory. Conflicts in regions such as Afghanistan, Central America, and Eastern Europe increased tensions even further. In 1983, the situation became especially volatile when the Soviet military shot down a civilian airliner. Korean Airlines Flight 007 shootdown after mistakenly believing it was a spy aircraft. This growing paranoia created an atmosphere of extreme tension inside the Soviet leadership. Intelligence agencies were instructed to monitor Western activity more closely than ever before. Military commanders were ordered to prepare for the possibility of sudden war. From the Soviet perspective, early 1980s looked like a period when the United States might attempt to change the global balance of power through force. In this environment of fear, mistrust, and military competition, even ordinary actions could be misinterpreted as threats. As Cold War tensions escalated in the early 1980s, Soviet leaders became increasingly obsessed with one terrifying possibility: a surprise nuclear strike from the West. They believed that if the United States launched such an attack without warning, the Soviet Union might not have enough time to retaliate. In the world of nuclear strategy, even a few minutes could mean the difference between survival and total destruction. To prevent this nightmare scenario, Soviet intelligence agencies launched one of the most secret and ambitious surveillance programs in their history. This operation was known as Operation RYAN. The name Ryan was an acronym derived from Russian words meaning nuclear missile attack. The program was developed jointly by the Soviet Intelligence Agency, the KGB, and the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. The GRU's goal was simple, but extremely challenging: detect the earliest possible signs that NATO might be preparing to launch a nuclear war. Unlike traditional intelligence missions that focused on gathering political or military secrets, Operation Ryan was designed to monitor a wide range of unusual indicators. Soviet agents working abroad were instructed to watch for small changes that might signal preparations for nuclear conflict. These included things like sudden increases in blood donations in Western countries, emergency meetings among political leaders, unusual activity at military bases, or unexpected movements of nuclear weapons. Soviet spies stationed across Europe and North America received detailed lists of warning signs they needed to monitor. If they noticed anything suspicious, they were required to report it immediately back to Moscow. By 1983, Operation Ryan had become one of the highest priorities for Soviet intelligence. Hundreds of agents around the world were involved in collecting data, and reports were being sent back to Moscow on a regular basis. Soviet leadership closely monitored these updates, searching for any indication that NATO forces might be preparing for war. When NATO began planning a military exercise known as Able Archer 83, Soviet intelligence agencies were already operating under intense pressure to detect signs of an attack. Every movement, every communication, and every unusual activity was carefully observed. What NATO leaders saw as routine training would soon trigger alarm inside the Soviet intelligence system. Because Operation Ryan had been designed specifically to detect the early stages of nuclear war preparation, the events that unfolded during Able Archer would appear to match exactly the kind of scenarios Soviet analysts feared the most. And as reports began arriving in Moscow, the possibility that NATO might be preparing for a real nuclear strike started to seem frighteningly real. In November 1983, NATO launched a military command exercise that would later become one of the most controversial events of the Cold War. The exercise was called Able Archer 83, and its purpose was to simulate the procedures NATO commanders would follow if a conflict with the Soviet Union escalated into nuclear war. NATO, formerly known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, regularly conducted military exercises to test coordination among its member states. These drills helped ensure that Allied forces could communicate effectively, respond quickly to threats, and carry out complex operations during a crisis. Able Archer was one of the final exercises in a larger training series known as Autumn Forge, which involved thousands of troops across Western Europe. However, Able Archer was different from many previous exercises. Instead of focusing on troop movements or battlefield tactics, this exercise concentrated on the command and communication systems used to authorize nuclear weapons. NATO commanders simulated the process by which political leaders and military officials would coordinate during a nuclear crisis. The exercise included secure communications, coded messages, and realistic decision-making scenarios involving high-level officials. Several aspects of the exercise made it appear unusually realistic. For example, NATO introduced new encryption methods for transmitting sensitive messages. These systems were designed to protect communication in the event of real war. But their use during the exercise created signals that looked authentic to outside observers. In addition, the exercise involved participation from senior military leaders, making it appear more serious than typical training drills. From the perspective of NATO commanders, these changes were simply improvements meant to make the exercise more effective. They wanted to test whether their command structure could function under the intense pressure of a nuclear crisis. The scenario simulated a gradual escalation from conventional warfare in Europe to the possible use of nuclear weapons if NATO forces were pushed to the brink of defeat. But across the Iron Curtain, Soviet intelligence analysts were closely watching these developments. Because of the surveillance efforts associated with Operation Ryan, Soviet observers were already searching for signs that NATO might be preparing for a surprise attack. When they detected the unusual communications activity and increased coordination among Western military commands, alarm bells began ringing inside the Soviet intelligence community. To Soviet analysts, the exercise looked very different from the way NATO intended it. Instead of appearing as routine training, it resembled the early stages of real nuclear war preparation. The realistic nature of the exercise, combined with the tense political climate of the early 1980s, made it seem possible that NATO might be using the drill as cover for an actual attack. Reports sent to Moscow began suggesting that Able Archer might not be just a simulation. Some analysts feared that Western leaders could be preparing to launch nuclear weapons while disguising their actions as part of a military exercise. Because Operation Ryan was designed to detect exactly this type of deception, Soviet intelligence officials took these signals very seriously. As the exercise progressed, Soviet leaders faced a terrifying question. Was NATO practicing nuclear war or preparing to start one? As the days of the NATO exercise unfolded, the growing number of intelligence reports reaching Moscow began to create deep anxiety among Soviet leaders. Observers monitoring NATO communications saw encrypted messages moving through command networks, high-level officials participating in military coordination, and simulated nuclear procedures being carried out. In isolation, none of these events would have been alarming, but viewed together, and through the lens of fear created by the Cold War, they began to look like the possible early stages of a real nuclear strike. Because of the ongoing surveillance program known as Operation Ryan, Soviet intelligence agencies had been specifically instructed to search for these kinds of warning signs. Analysts compared the events unfolding during the NATO drill with the indicators they had been trained to identify. The similarities were unsettling. Communication patterns, command procedures, and military coordination all seemed to match what might happen if NATO were preparing to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. Inside the Soviet government, concern quickly began to spread among military commanders and intelligence officials. The country was still led by Yuri Andropov, whose background as a former intelligence chief made him particularly sensitive to the possibility of a surprise Western attack. Andropov had long believed that the United States might attempt to gain a strategic advantage by launching nuclear weapons before the Soviet Union could respond. This fear shaped how Soviet leaders interpreted the events of November 1983, as intelligence reports continued to arrive. Some officials began to worry that NATO might be using the exercise as a cover for a real military operation. If that were true, it would mean that the Soviet Union could be facing an imminent nuclear strike. In response to these fears, Soviet military forces quietly began increasing their level of readiness. Nuclear-capable aircraft belonging to the Soviet Air Forces were reportedly placed on higher alert. In some regions of Eastern Europe, missile units were prepared for rapid deployment. Soviet commanders also increased surveillance of NATO military bases and communication networks to gather additional information about what might be happening. These actions were not public, and people outside the Soviet military establishment had no idea how serious the situation had become. Across Europe and North America, everyday life continued as normal. NATO leaders had no idea that their training exercise was causing alarm within the Soviet Union. To them, Able Archer was simply another routine drill designed to improve military readiness. They did not realize that Soviet analysts were interpreting the exercise as evidence of a possible nuclear attack. This gap in understanding created a classic Cold War scenario's two powerful nuclear rivals observing each other through suspicion and incomplete information. On one side, NATO commanders believed they were conducting normal training operations. On the other side, Soviet leaders feared they might be witnessing the final preparations for war. For several tense days, this misunderstanding pushed the world closer to a potential catastrophe. If Soviet leaders had become convinced that an attack was truly underway, they might have decided to launch their own nuclear weapons before it was too late. In the high-stakes world of Cold War strategy, even a small misinterpretation could have triggered a chain reaction leading to global destruction. During the peak of the NATO exercise, the atmosphere inside Soviet military command centers became increasingly tense. Intelligence analysts continued monitoring communications and movements associated with Able Archer 83, trying to determine whether the activity represented a real threat. Each new report added another piece to a puzzle that was already difficult to interpret. Some officials believed the exercise might simply be a training operation, while others feared it could be the final stage of preparation before a nuclear strike. At the heart of the problem was the logic of Cold War nuclear strategy. Both the United States and the Soviet Union relied on the principle of deterrence to prevent war. This concept was based on the idea that if either side launched nuclear weapons, the other would retaliate with devastating force. The result would be mutual destruction. Because of this balance, neither side wanted to strike first. But the strategy also created a terrifying risk. If one side believed that an attack was already underway, it might launch its own missiles immediately in order to avoid being destroyed. This scenario was known as launch on warning, a strategy that allowed nuclear weapons to be fired as soon as early warning systems detected incoming missiles. While this approach was meant to preserve the ability to retaliate, it also meant that leaders sometimes had only a few minutes to decide whether to begin a nuclear war. During Able Archer, Soviet leaders feared that NATO might be preparing to use a similar strategy. But if the exercise were actually a cover for a real attack, waiting too long to respond could leave the Soviet Union vulnerable. The pressure to make the right decision was enormous, and the consequences of a mistake could have been catastrophic. Meanwhile, NATO commanders were completely unaware of how their exercise was being interpreted. The simulation continued according to plan, with participants practicing nuclear command procedures and communication protocols. For them, The exercise represented an important opportunity to test military readiness during a hypothetical crisis. But historians later discovered that the situation had become much more dangerous than NATO realized at the time. Declassified intelligence reports suggest that Soviet forces in parts of Eastern Europe had entered a heightened state of alert during the exercise. Nuclear-capable aircraft were prepared for rapid deployment, and military units were closely monitoring NATO activity. Fortunately, several factors helped prevent the crisis from escalating further. Soviet intelligence analysts eventually began to notice signs that the NATO activity might indeed be part of an exercise, rather than preparations for a real attack. The absence of certain key indicators, such as large-scale troop mobilization or missile fueling operations, suggested that war might not be imminent after all. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear that NATO was not launching a surprise strike. When the exercise finally concluded, tensions inside Soviet command structures slowly began to ease. Forces that had been placed on higher alert gradually returned to their normal readiness levels. Although the world never realized how close the situation had come to disaster at the time, historians now consider Able Archer 83 to be one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. It demonstrated how easily misunderstandings between nuclear superpowers could escalate into potentially catastrophic confrontations. When the NATO exercise finally came to an end in November 1983, the immediate danger began to fade. The simulated war scenario associated with Able Archer 83 concluded as planned, and participating commanders returned to their normal duties. Within NATO, the exercise was viewed as a successful training operation that had helped test communication systems and decision-making procedures under simulated crisis conditions. But on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the experience left a lasting impression on Soviet leaders. For several days, they had seriously considered the possibility that NATO might be preparing to launch a nuclear strike. The realization that a military exercise could create such fear revealed how fragile the balance of peace had become during the Cold War. Inside the Soviet government, analysts began reviewing intelligence reports collected during the exercise. They concluded that the NATO activity had indeed been a training operation rather than a preparation for war. However, the fact that it had appeared so convincing raised serious concerns about the potential for future misunderstandings. The episode also influenced thinking inside the United States. Although NATO commanders were initially unaware of the Soviet reaction, Western intelligence agencies later discovered how alarmed the Soviet leadership had been during Able Archer. This information reached President Ronald Reagan, who was reportedly surprised by the depth of Soviet fear. Reagan had long believed that strong military pressure would force the Soviet Union to negotiate from a position of weakness. But learning about the Able Archer crisis caused him to reconsider some aspects of this strategy. If Soviet leaders truly believed that the United States might launch a surprise nuclear attack, then aggressive military exercises and rhetoric could increase the risk of accidental war. This realization contributed to a gradual shift in Cold War diplomacy during the later 1980s. Reagan began exploring opportunities for dialogue and arms control agreements with Soviet leaders. These efforts eventually led to important negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the new leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Together, Reagan and Gorbachev worked toward reducing nuclear tensions and limiting the number of weapons held by both superpowers. Their cooperation eventually produced agreements such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles from Europe. Looking back, historians now see Able Archer 83 as a powerful reminder of how dangerous the Cold War truly was. At the time, ordinary citizens had no idea how close the world might have come to catastrophe. The crisis unfolded quietly, hidden behind classified intelligence reports and secret military communications. Today, the story serves as an important lesson about the risks of misunderstanding between powerful nations. When fear, suspicion, and limited information shape decision-making, even routine actions can appear threatening. In a world where nuclear weapons still exist, the lessons of Able Archer remain as relevant as ever. And for a few tense days in November 1983, humanity unknowingly stood on the edge of a disaster that could have changed history forever. As we look back at the events of November 1983, it's almost unbelievable how close the world may have come to catastrophe without most people even realizing it. At the time, millions of people across the globe were simply living their normal lives, going to work, attending school, watching the news, and planning for the future. Yet behind the scenes, deep within military command centers and intelligence agencies, a dangerous misunderstanding was unfolding between two nuclear superpowers. What was intended to be a routine NATO training exercise had been interpreted by Soviet analysts as a possible preparation for nuclear war. For a few tense days, leaders inside the Soviet Union feared that the United States and its allies might be preparing to launch a devastating first strike. The exercise at the center of this crisis, Able Archer 83, revealed just how fragile the balance of peace was during the Cold War. Both sides possessed enormous nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over. Their entire strategy depended on deterrence, the belief that the fear of mutual destruction would prevent either side from attacking first. But the Able Archer incident showed that even when no one intended to start a war, fear and misinterpretation could still push the world dangerously close to one. One of the most unsettling aspects of this story is how easily the situation could have escalated. If Soviet leaders had become fully convinced that a nuclear strike was about to begin, they might have decided to launch their own weapons before it was too late. In the high-pressure environment of Cold War military planning, leaders sometimes had only minutes to interpret intelligence reports and make decisions that could affect the entire planet. A single misjudgment, a misread signal, or an overreaction could have triggered a chain of events leading to global nuclear conflict. Fortunately, that moment never came. As the exercise ended and more information became available, Soviet leaders gradually realized that the NATO activity had been a simulation rather than a real attack. The heightened military alerts were slowly relaxed, and the immediate danger faded away, but the episode left a deep impression on both sides. When Western intelligence later discovered how alarmed Soviet leadership had been, it became clear that the world had narrowly avoided a potentially catastrophic misunderstanding. The experience also influenced future diplomacy. Leaders such as Ronald Reagan eventually recognized that the Soviet Union's fears were genuine, even if they seemed exaggerated from the Western perspective. Understanding this fear helped open the door for dialogue and negotiations with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev later in the decade. Their discussions would eventually contribute to arms reduction agreements and a gradual easing of Cold War tensions. Today, the story of Able Archer serves as a powerful reminder that history is not only shaped by battles and wars, but also by moments when disaster was narrowly avoided. It shows how easily misunderstandings between powerful nations can escalate, especially when trust is low and communication is limited. The Cold War eventually ended, but the lessons of that era remain incredibly important. Even in the modern world, nuclear weapons still exist, and global tensions still arise between major powers. The events of 1983 remind us that preventing conflict requires not only military strength, but also clear communication, diplomacy, and a willingness to understand the fears and perspectives of others. Because sometimes the difference between peace and catastrophe can come down to something as small as a misunderstood signal or a training exercise that looks a little too real. And perhaps the most chilling part of this story is that most people never knew it was happening at all. For a brief moment in history, humanity unknowingly stood on the edge of a possible nuclear war. And the world was saved simply because the misunderstanding eventually faded before anyone made the wrong move.